today, remote interviews. I've put a question in the chat box. It'd be good to know, and as a little icebreaker as well, if any of you here today have already had experience of remote interviews, because they're not a new thing, and I think we'll see this going through the session. They're certainly not something that's just come about as a result of COVID-19. Employers have been using remote interviews for a long time now, actually. Particularly large graduate recruiters have been using remote interviews for a number of years, and we've been supporting students in managing remote interviews for a long time. So if you have experience of remote interviews, if you wouldn't mind sharing that in the chat box, that would be great, just so I've got a sense of where everyone's coming from today in terms of their experience. But in terms of the agenda of what I will cover, like I said, I'm happy to be flexible around your questions, what you want to get out of today's session. But loosely, what I'm going to cover is the format that remote interviews might take. There's various formats that they might take. What are some of the common mistakes interviewees make during remote interviews, and how you might best prepare? And we'll cover some techniques to form answers as well. So leaping straight into the session today, we'll cover the format. So there's a couple of formats really that a remote interview might take. These are some of the common ones that I've listed here. So online interviewing, it might be live. So you might be chatting to somebody in person, like we are now. I'm here. I'm not a figment of your imagination. And it might be like this. So it might be over something like Teams. It might be over Skype. It might be over Zoom. So a face-to-face interaction. Like you might be used to after the last few months of lockdown. However, some interviews are pre-recorded. Now, this style of interviewing is often used by larger organisations who recruit large number of graduates every year. So some of the big graduate employers have used pre-recorded interviews for a number of years, actually. Some of the household names that you'll know of have used pre-recorded interviews for a while. Now, a pre-recorded interview, the way it works is that you will probably be sent a link via email, and you will probably have a week. It will tell you you've got approximately a week to click on that link and record your interview. And you can do that at any time within that week. It's entirely up to you when you want to do it within that time block. With pre-recorded interviews, once you click on that link, that's it. There isn't really an option to go back and change it. So be aware of that. They often include practice sessions, so that a lot of employers will include a link for you to practice and become familiar with the software that they're asking you to use. But be aware that once you click start on that interview, most employers will not allow you to start and stop and go back again. That's the real deal. So be aware of that. So make sure that when you click into the interview button, you really do feel ready to go and that you have practiced beforehand. With these pre-recorded interviews, they're often timed as well. So what generally happens is you will just see yourself back. You will see, your webcam, what it's recording, and a question will then flash up on screen. And usually you've got about a minute or so, not much longer than that, to answer that question. And you'll see the countdown clock on your screen, which for some that can feel quite off-putting, actually. Now, that's not a long time to provide, a detailed answer. So it does take a lot of practice. So that's the first key message is that if you have particularly a pre-recorded interview coming up, that practice is going to be your best friend, because bear in mind that you will have to deliver answers under timed conditions. And it can feel a little bit unnatural, and we're going to cover that in a moment or two. It is slightly different doing a pre-recorded interview to a face-to-face one. There's pros and cons of both. Now, employers use these pre-recorded interviews, particularly when they've got a lot of recruitment to get through, because they can work through them in their own time. It's a much more efficient way than having to schedule 100 different interviews with 100 different people. They can just get 100 links and watch them whenever it fits in for them. So we are seeing more and more employers use these types of interviews. So, you might expect to have a pre-recorded interview. If not now, maybe in the future. Another type of remote interview, again, not a new technique, is the telephone interview. Most employers will tell you exactly when they're going to call you, so you can be prepared, you can feel relaxed, and it's a much better scenario when you know when they're going to call. However, it is not unheard of for employers to call out of the blue. Sometimes that happens, not all the time, and I wouldn't say it's the best practice, but it does happen. We have students that tell us that they've received calls out of the blue from an employer that wants to chat through their application, even albeit informally. So be aware of that when you make any job application. You could be contacted the following day with a link to an interview that you have to record within a week. You might be contacted and said, "Oh, look, can we have a phone call, tomorrow?" Or they might just ring you. So that's something to be aware of. So when you are applying to any job, make sure you prepare before you submit your application. So, this is why another reason why the scattergun approach to sending your CV out to 100 different employers is not the best route to take. Because even if, generally that doesn't get you, through the door to an interview, but even if it did, you're gonna have a hard job in preparing in a very short space of time, which it sometimes can be, particularly in the current climate. Sometimes recruitment can take longer, but often now when an employer's got a need for somebody, it can be more of an urgent need. So the recruitment turnaround could be quick. You don't know. So, be prepared before you even submit your CV or application form. So some important considerations with remote interviews are that, for telephone interviews and pre-recorded interviews where you're not face to face with somebody, it can feel a little bit unnatural actually, because a large part of interviews, is about reading the body language of one another, using those cues to think, have I given them enough information? And someone else's body language can actually help you to feel at ease sometimes, just somebody smiling, somebody nodding, that can help you to feel so much better in the interview. And obviously with a pre-recorded interview, you don't even have their tone of voice to read. So do bear that in mind. And again, that practice will help you to become more familiar and more comfortable with that style of interviewing. Because like I said, it can at first feel quite unnatural, and difficult to build that rapport. So that practice again is so crucial for this, because it is different to what you might be used to. Like I've said before, remote interview is not new. It's not something that has just come around out of COVID-19. So some organisations are well practiced in this and well polished. So you'll often find your experience can be very smooth. However, for some organisations, this is very new. They've never used this before. So they might be learning alongside you with this. So, be sympathetic if it's not as smooth as it might be. Some organisations have had to turn this around very quickly. They might not have a HR team to support them. They might be doing it themselves. So, it might feel a little bit clunky for some businesses, and that's probably because it might be new to them. That being said, I think all businesses, this is the only way that they can interview at this moment in time. So, they'll probably be a little bit more leeway, I imagine, than there might have been previously, around sort of, little dips in your signal, sort of, other issues that might crop up, and we're going to cover what those could be throughout. So they might be a little bit more sympathetic to those than usual. So that's worth bearing in mind. And it's also worth considering that actually for many organisations, this might now be the new norm. I don't expect that, once lockdown is over and, COVID-19 becomes a distant memory, video interviewing, remote interviewing will stop. We actually expect it will continue. It was a trend before COVID-19. We were seeing more and more recruiters use it. So we expect it to continue. So, the fact that you are looking into this now is great, because it's likely to be, a feature in your career as you progress, as you go for promotions and different roles. You're likely to come up against this moving forward. So some common mistakes. Now, the first common mistake is, it's a common mistake for any type of interview, whether it's in person, physically, or online, and that's under preparing. I've said before, doing that preparation from the get-go can pay dividends. Ultimately, when you apply for a job, an employer wants to know, and these are very simple things: can you do the job? And then, can you do my job? Not can you do any job? And why do you want to work for my company? So, I don't want to know that you just need a job. Everyone, most people need a job. But why do you want to work for my business? I'm the one paying you. So you need to know about my company. You need to know about some of the challenges that I might be facing, some of the opportunities that might be out there for me. And you need to go above and beyond the About Us page on the website. So, a typical question, and we'll cover some typical questions later on in the session, is likely to be, why do you want to work for us? And, just regurgitating, I know you were founded in 1992 and have 200 employees. Well, why does that tell the employer you want to work for them? You've got to ask yourself. So actually genuinely thinking, why am I interested in this employer? What are they doing that's exciting to me? What about this role makes me tick? What's going to get me out of bed on a morning and get me excited about going into work to do this job? The more authentic your answer, the better it will be, because it will be more convincing to that employer. And it will communicate really well why you want to work for them. So make sure you do that preparation. And a good way you can do that is via social media. So make it easier for yourself. Social media is current for a lot of organizations. Their websites are probably not updated that regularly, whereas social media is probably fed into a few times a day. So you get some wonderful insights into what projects they're involved with, things about their corporate social responsibility, if that's an important factor to you. So you can glean so much from social media. And some larger companies actually have dedicated careers social media sites. So PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the largest graduate recruiters in this country, has a dedicated careers social media channel where they'll share stories about their new graduate intakes, their placement students. They'll share advice, tips, all sorts on there. So do check that out. So that research I can't stress enough. And we'll also cover how you can prepare through rereading the job spec as well. Not reading the instructions carefully is another bugbear of a lot of the employers that we speak to, particularly when it comes to the pre-recorded interviews. Generally, the advice you get with those pre-recorded interviews when you get the link is very good and it's clear. And not reading it and saying, "Oh, I didn't realize I had to do this," it's not going to go down well. It doesn't put you in the best light. Not having read the information. So just make sure you read over those instructions carefully. If there is something that you're unclear on, go back to them beforehand. Don't wait until you do the interview and then come back and say, "Oh, I didn't know it meant that." Ask them. Recruitment teams would rather you ask them before than after you've completed the interview and it's not quite gone your way. So most organizations will have a dedicated person managing any one vacancy. So do ask them questions. Don't be afraid to do that. Or if you wanted to ask the careers team for our advice, we are happy to support you. So do drop us any questions if there's anything that you're not quite clear on when it comes to a remote interview that you're preparing for. Another common mistake is background interference. So, the interviewer, will be concentrating on you. They'll be concentrating on your answers, and you want them to do that. So you don't want them to be distracted by anyone walking across the background. So actually having an interview in a public space isn't always the best idea. There can be a lot of background noise, which means they can't always hear what you're saying that clearly. Think about, what might actually be in your background. So are there any posters, for example, distracting them? More of a plain background might work quite nicely for you. So make sure you consider that noise, any sort of visuals in the background. Make sure the people who you might be living with are aware that you've got an interview, and ask them, to be quiet for that period of time. Usually when we're back on campus, we can arrange a space for you to conduct an interview, and hopefully when we are back on campus, that will happen again. But for now, you know, make the people around you aware of the fact that you are having an interview, and do tell them to be quiet if possible, because that can distract you and it can distract the interviewer. Poor body language is another common mistake that people make on an interview, on a video interview. Um, you might be in your home environment, you might feel relaxed, and that's great. That's really good, actually, going into an interview and feeling relaxed. But it can come with the caveat that we can sometimes feel a little bit too relaxed. We might not, you talking into a camera, particularly if there's not somebody you can see at the other end, you might forget to smile, to make eye contact. So don't be looking at the ceiling or the floor, out the window, looking bored. Really consider that, actually. It's important. We've got a tool where you can practice video interviewing, and you can record yourself and play yourself back. I know it's horrible. I hate doing that myself. I hate the sound of my own voice. You'll probably cringe, but it's worth doing. So you can look at your body language and pick up any habits that you might not have even known you had. So that's another top tip as well. Dressing appropriately for an interview is another one. Like I said before, you might be very relaxed in your home environment. We've all been in our home environment for a long time now, possibly, and it can be easy to slip into a very informal, casual mode. But for an interview, treat it like any other interview. Treat it like an interview you would go to in person. So make sure you dress appropriately for the employer that you are applying to. So don't forget to do that. And of course, technical issues. Now, I am very sympathetic to technical issues at this moment in time. I experience them daily, so I know how stressful they can be. So, check and check again before that interview. Use, if you can, try the software that they ask you to use. If they're asking you to use Zoom, have a play around with Zoom beforehand. If it's Teams, if it's Google Hangout, have a go, try and, just playing around with it before the day, just so you're familiar with that software that they're asking you to use. Also with your internet, make sure you close as many windows as you can if you're using your desktop. Shut those windows down. If you are living with other people, you might think about asking them, don't do any live streaming, because I'm doing an interview and it might interfere with the speed of the internet. So technical issues, prepare beforehand for them. They might arise, and employers, I'm sure, will be sympathetic to that, but try and minimize the risk of that happening. Do everything you can to make life easy for yourself, because it can feel very stressful when there are technical issues. So there's some top tips. Just make sure you close all your windows, make sure any other devices are switched off that might be interfering with your internet, and become familiar with the software beforehand. Practice being on camera, like I've said, and become more familiar with the tech that you're going to be asked to use. So what you can do to prepare now, I've got some top tips lined up, but here's some in a nutshell. So do your research thoroughly before you apply. Keep a copy of your application form and the job description and person specification to hand. Now, this is really key, and it's key not just for remote interviews, it's for any interview, because ultimately in the interview, you will be asked how you meet the requirements of the job description and person specification. Usually it's the person specification that they go off. So after a job advert has closed, usually you won't have access to that anymore. And this is, you know, a real howler a lot of people make. They'll apply for a job and then that job advert goes because the vacancy closes and they can't get back to it. So they think, oh my goodness, what are they what are they actually asking for? What were the details of this job? You know, how can I prepare my answers, because I can't see that person spec anymore. So any job advert that you apply to, save a copy of it. Save the person spec, any documents that they provide you with at the application stage, save them, make a copy of them, because you will need them later on in the process. So I've got an example here. You know, this is a person spec that's actually used at Leeds Beckett University, and it outlines here what they will be asking you about in the interview. So there's a lot of companies that will use a person specification like this, and they're great. They are best friend because it tells you what they will be covering in the interview. So it says here, you will be assessed on this. So keeping a copy of this is so essential, because once that vacancy closes, that will no longer be there, and you're going to feel a little bit embarrassed having to approach them saying, oh, sorry, I didn't save a copy of it, can you send me it? It's, again, not the best start. You know, be organized beforehand. That prep will really pay off, and this can really help you to formulate great answers, because you're being told, you know, what we might be looking for in a candidate, what we might be asking you about. So interviews are not something that you're going into blind. You do have an idea. You will be able to prepare some answers, because you've got they are telling you what they're looking for. So there are some questions that you can certainly start to prep for beforehand, and we're going to cover how you can do that in a moment. Like I said, these other top tips: find a quiet and appropriate space, dress appropriately, turn off other devices, you know, check your tech beforehand and read those instructions. But onto that point around preparing your answers, like I said, it's not something that's impossible. If you know, for example, they are going to ask you about ability to deal with a wide range of correspondence and prepare and present appropriate responses. You know, here they're saying we're looking for that. You know, maintain, collate, and present information and data, prepare reports. Okay, well, we're going to look for that a little bit in your application, and we're going to ask you about that in the interview. So knowing that they're going to ask me about, you know, here, preparing reports, you know, you can start to think about, well, how would I provide an example of a time where I did that? Um, so have a think of what examples you might use. And a useful technique to start practicing before you're going into an interview and while you're in the interview is what we call the CAR technique. You might have, it's sometimes called CAR, it's sometimes called CAB, it's sometimes called STAR. So any one of those terms, they ultimately do the same thing. So CAR, context: where were you? What were you doing? Okay, so you might have been at university, and it might have been a certain module where you had to prepare a report on X, Y, and Z. And give me the context. So it's like telling a story. So set that scene. You know, was it a big report? Was it a tiny report? Who was it for? What was your time frame? So really start to set that scene for me so I can visualize it. And then you want to tell them, this is the juicy bit of your story. What was the action? So, what was the action you took? Now, try and avoid using phrases like, we did this, we did that, even if you were in a group setting, because the employer isn't hiring the group, they're hiring you. So, they want to know what you did within that group setting. So tell them about what action you took, and then what was the result. So you've got me hooked now, like any good story. You know, I'm hooked. Don't leave me hanging. We all know how disappointing it is where something ends and on a cliffhanger, and you think, oh, tell me what happens next. Tell them what was the result. So did you get some great feedback? You know, did you know, if you using an example from some work, did a customer give you some good feedback? Did they return time and time again? You know, did you get the top grade in the class? What was it? You know, how do you know you did what they're asking for well? You know, what tells you you have that skill, and you know, what feedback have you got to convince them of that. So that can be really useful in helping you to frame your answers. So looking back at that job advert, at the person specification, sometimes there won't always be a separate person specification. If that's the case, look through the job advert and you will be able to pull out some keywords. You know, it might be, we are looking for X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, I can start preparing my interview answers based on X, Y, and Z. It might say the ideal candidate will have. And again, you can look at all those criteria and start thinking, well, where can I demonstrate that competency? So that's something to be aware of. And like I said, you know, interviews are something you can prepare for, and the more that you prepare, the more comfortable you'll feel, the more confident you will feel, and the more your answers will be far more well developed. And you'll be able to come out of that interview thinking, you know, I did a good job, as opposed to, oh, I wish I'd have said this, I wish I'd have said that. There might still be a little bit of that, but generally using that CAR method really helps you to develop your answers quite well. Here are some typical example questions now. I've put these on here with the caveat that actually there are different types of interviews. So the type that I've just talked about is what we call a competency-based interview. So they're wanting you to provide them with examples of when you have demonstrated a particular competency, like report writing, communication skills, teamwork. So it might be, you know, describe a situation when you have led a team, because what you are doing there is you're telling them that you've got that competency because you're able to demonstrate it before. There are different styles of interviews. Now, we don't have time to cover them all today, but be aware of that. We've got lots of resources available on My Hub that map out different types of interviews. One of the more common ones is a strengths-based interview. So that's basically runs on the rationale that, you know, if you're good at something, if you like doing it, you know, that tells us that you probably have what we need. So they might say, you know, do you enjoy looking after, you know, providing excellent customer service? And rather than just saying, yes, I enjoy providing excellent customer service, it's the same sort of concept. You should give an example of when you've done that before, you know, where you've illustrated that. Yeah, I really enjoy going above and beyond for the customer. An example of a time when I've done that is, and then you're into the context, action, result. Okay, so the way you prepare is quite similar. It's just the style of questions they might ask can be different, but there's lots of support available on My Hub to help you to understand different types of interview style. They will usually tell you if they're using an interview style that's different to competency-based. Competency-based interviews are the most commonly used, but there are other styles. Usually they will tell you if they're using a certain type of questioning, not always. So it's just worth being aware of the different types of interview questions you might get. There are sometimes some curveballs thrown in there. So sometimes there will be some really obscure questions. Some companies like to use these, and you know, it can throw you. They will seem really bizarre. You know, it could be asked about anything, and it probably won't be anything to do with the job, and it can make you feel flustered. The reason that they ask those questions is to see how you cope under pressure. They're not after the answer necessarily. They don't always expect you to know something. So they might give you some really complex mathematical question that they want, you're expected to answer on the spot. Actually, they're not expecting you to provide them with the accurate answer. It's, they want to see if you can remain calm under pressure and how you think on your feet. So the best thing to do in that scenario, if you have got a question that you think that's definitely a curveball question, is, admit to it if you don't know the answer, but talk them through how you would reach that answer. So you talk them through the methodology that you would use to arrive at an answer. So if you really don't know something, you could say, I don't know, but this is how I would find out. This is the process I would use. So be aware that curveball questions can creep in there, and be aware that they're not always asking you that question because they expect you to have the answer to it. it's assessing your ability to cope under pressure. And if that's a key competency that's listed in that person specification or job advert, you might expect that might be something that could come up. Don't always, but be aware that sometimes they do. Another top tip on interviews is to have some questions prepared. And again, this applies to remote interviews and face-to-face interviews. Generally at the end of an interview, an employer will ask you if you have any questions. Remember, an interview is a two-way process. It's as much designed for you to find out if that job's for you as it is for that employer to find out whether you're the right candidate for their business. So do remember that it's a great opportunity to find out whether you think you'll fit in with that organisation. So there might be questions that you could ask around the organisational culture. You might ask more about, the job that you'll be doing. So is it really a job that I'm going to enjoy? So you might ask about, a typical day, or what are some of the achievements that they will expect from you in the first few months of the job. What might the first 3 months look like, for example? So, think of those questions. So yes, you might have questions about the salary, because some companies don't always disclose the salary, but that will tell you so much about it. And yes, it can have a huge impact on your decision, but also think of a few others that tell you more about what the day-to-day job is like, what the environment is like, because again, that can really help you to make that informed decision. And it also shows that you've got a real interest in the business and you're starting to imagine yourself working there. So always prepare a few questions in advance. And then the final tip is practice. We've said that throughout this session. It will help you to feel more comfortable. It will help you to feel more confident. So you could practice with family and friends. You can practice using our online interview simulator. Like I said, that's a great tool for watching yourself back, identifying your body language, identifying some things that you might not have even known you did. So yeah, use that tool. It can help you to feel more comfortable. For some of you, it may still feel very alien, this tech world that we're in at the moment. I appreciate for some of you may feel pretty camera shy. The more you practice, the easier it will become. So do use that tool. I've put the link to it at the bottom of this slide here. It is on My Hub. If you just log into My Hub as well, you will find your way there. So do use that tool. And we are always here in the careers team to arrange a mock interview with you as well. And the benefit of that is that we do all our appointments at the moment over the phone. So if you've got a telephone interview coming up, that's something we can certainly help with. And if at special requests, we can do them over Skype via video if that's something you wanted to practice as well. So if you do have one coming up, remember that support is there for you. So that's my run through on virtual interviews. So to wrap up, the key points from the session were that there are different types of virtual interviews that you can expect. You might be talking to somebody live, but equally they might be pre-recorded. So be aware that there are differences. Telephone interviews, they can be held at a very, very quick turnaround. You might submit your application and you might receive a call the next day. So be prepared. Make sure you've done your research before you submit that application. Make sure that you've studied that job spec very carefully. Make sure it's saved. And then that will allow you to start prepping your answers using the CAR method. Make sure you dress appropriately for the session and make sure that you minimize background disturbances. Check your tech beforehand, and that will put you in a far better position to succeed on a virtual interview. So that's the session wrapping up now. This is now completely over to you. So if you've got any questions now, please do share them in the chat function. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have based on what I've said during the session. Don't worry if they feel very unique to you, because the chances are it can help somebody else. So do ask any questions. If I've not covered anything during the session that you hope to get out of it, now's your chance to ask that question. Don't leave this session without finding out the information that you came to get today. So do use the chat box now. If there aren't any other questions, we'll wrap it up there. As a final thought, the call to action would be to practice using our interview simulator. I will stay around on the chat. The chat remains live even when the sessions ended, even when the recordings ended. So I'll stay around for the next 20 minutes or so. So if anyone did want to use the chat function there, I will be here. So do say a hello, or if there's any sort of questions that you've got, or if you do want to arrange a mock interview, do come and see us. You can book in via My Hub. So do check that out there. And there's lots, like I said, lots of useful advice available for you there. Thanks everyone for joining today. I hope you found the session useful and look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care all.